Good evening. I'm Eleanor Murray, Associate Dean for Executive Education here at the Saïd Business School, University of Oxford. And I'm delighted to introduce, in conversation with Joana Probert, who's our Jen Jingson Career Development Fellow here at the Saïd Business School. Joana, welcome. You've chosen a career in academia. Can you start by sharing with us what attracted you to that role?
I actually chose academia twice in my life. I started my career in the natural science, studying neuroscience and then experimental psychology. And in both cases, I was studying cognitive processes. And back then, what attracted me to academia was my curiosity to understand how the mind works. I then left academia for a while and I did a few different things, hopefully not the topic here, but that was a period of experimentation, learning, discovery. And my biggest learning from that period of experimentation was learning and really realizing the impact that leaders have in everyone's lives. And so I became extremely curious about understanding the human complexities in running organizations, particularly those in the top organizations, because of the very ripple effect that they can cause. And so I think it was again my curiosity and love of learning, this time about leaders and leadership, that had brought me back to academia.
Thank you. And did you have any particular focus on leaders in a particular sector or particular country or?
My focus have been on leaders on the top. So for my PhD study, I looked at new CEOs, trying to understand really the subjective experience that the individual goes through as he or she tries to become the leader of the organization. So my focus was in many different industries and contexts, but thinking about a particular role.
Yeah, that sounds really interesting because I think the experiences of new CEOs is something that maybe hasn't been looked at quite so often. We tend to look at established CEOs, established leaders. So it's that transitionary period of someone moving into a new role that sounds really interesting.
Yes, it is really interesting because usually research that looked at CEO succession, the period of transition, has focused mostly on the organization itself and how a new CEO can impact the organization, the performance, the survival. But there was not much, both in theory and in practice, looking at the individual experience and the transition period that the individual go through.
Yeah, so it sounds really fascinating. We'll come back to that later on in our discussions and explore some of your research in a little more depth. But I'm interested, given International Women's Day is our focus today, can you tell me about your personal experience of being a woman in academia?
It's interesting. That's a bit of a hard question. I think it's easier for me to think about my experience, but I don't know if I can separate my experience from the experience of being a woman because I have no comparison base to think of how would it be if I was not a woman. So I can think about my experience. And I think I've always been very lucky that I had some amazing role models and mentors who have, both men and women, who have supported me and mentored me in my career. I think another interesting thing that I see in my experience, especially coming back now in a business school environment, is that I think there's a paradox being an academic, because in one hand, you are an institution, you have all the backing, the structure, sometimes the constraints of being an institution. But on the other hand, you're a bit of an entrepreneur as well, because you need to think about the vision of how you see the strategic planning of your research pipeline. So I think there's this kind of the two things that slash entrepreneurs slash very established institutions, especially in an institution like Oxford.
Yeah.
Another aspect, I think, sorry to.
No, do go ahead, do go ahead.
I think another thing that I'm a qualitative researcher. So I think another thing of my experience has been about also kind of let the research emerge and flow. And sometimes you have an idea, even though you might have a kind of strategic plan, that the idea what the research is actually going to end up being kind of can transform. And I think learning to kind of let go of what you thought something was going to end up and just kind of go with the data, with comments and reviewers, and just let the project kind of take a life on its own, I think has also been very interesting and fascinating with the research that I do.
Yes, you've introduced lots of really interesting ideas there, I think. And I'm interested in what you found to be the ideal sort of, or the best qualities in a role model or mentor.
That's a very good question. I think it's somebody who sees you and see your challenges and your strengths. And so each individual, it's different, and each individual is going to have weaknesses and strengths and interests. And I think I've been very lucky that the people who have supported me have helped kind of help me find my own unique space and my unique voice. And I think that has been the biggest help in a role model, is giving tools and support for individuals to discover themselves.
Yes, I think that's really true. And I was interested in the fact that you were saying you like to sort of pursue ideas, and where you end up isn't necessarily where you thought you started, because I think sometimes people assume that in research you have a clear trajectory and you follow that through all the way to your sort of final paper or publication. But it's interesting your experience is different to that. And what benefits have you found from just following the flow?
Benefits. I think it's almost like, I remember when I started doing qualitative research, having moved from natural science, I kind of expected to be more kind of the plans and the ideas I had. So I think in the beginning I was forcing my ideas, and the data was kind of not telling me what I wanted it to tell. So I think it was a bit of a learning experience. Maybe the type of research that I do now, you kind of have to go with the flow, because you might have an idea of what things are, but actually the data might tell you otherwise. Or you might get some unnecessary pushback, but you might see that to actually kind of translate what you have in your mind or what your findings mean to other people, then you might need to kind of change the way you're talking about, or you might realize the potential is different than the potential that you expected. And in my experience, that actually has been the most interesting projects, where you kind of just let the research take you.
Yes, thank you. I think that's really helpful. And I'm interested in your role. You have a role here at Oxford as a Career Development Fellow. It'd be interesting to hear a little bit about what that role is, what that means, and what positive visibility does this create for you?
That's a very interesting question, because I don't think I have a specific. I assumed the post in July 2020. So pretty much a lot of being in this post has been through the pandemic. And so I think I kind of figure out for myself what I think the post means, but I have never received a specific guidance. And many people I talk to don't actually know what the CDF role is. So the way I envision what the CDF role is kind of a mix between because Oxford doesn't have assistant professors.
Yes.
So it's almost like I see as a mix between an assistant professor, so someone in the first letter of the professorship, but it's a mix between that and a mix between what in the US system would be an adjunct faculty, because it doesn't have the same career projection that usually is considered with an assistant professor. So that's the way I see the role, as kind of a mix between the two. I don't know if it's the correct perception, but that's my understanding of it.
And what positive visibility does the role create for you as an academic?
I think first there's opportunities such as this one to be more visible. I think there's an opportunity to engage in different teachings with different audiences that perhaps I wouldn't otherwise. Again, it has been a lot of online connections because of being when I started the role being in the pandemic. But I think I'm looking forward to see what changes now that we're starting to start doing more face to face.
Yes, that's interesting because I think a lot of academics have had to really adapt and flex according to COVID and the pandemic, and where that's left them in terms of building connections, building networks. So, what has it offered? Unexpected positive opportunities that you hadn't previously imagined?
Not necessarily anything unimaginable. No, I think it's just moving along a career trajectory that I think it's been something that I've been building on. And so I think it's just making sure that you're starting to get more connections and more visibility and more interactions that you wouldn't have otherwise.
Yes, yes. And what strategies have you adopted to build your career in academia? Because I'm conscious that there's a whole range of strategies that academics might adopt, but I'm interested to know what have you adopted, and have any of those been influenced by the fact you're a woman in academia?
I think the biggest influence of my strategy has been I left academia before my first time I left academia because perhaps of a fault of my own, I couldn't see the impact of my research. It
Mm.
was very remote for me. Others might have been able to see the connection, but I didn't really, it wasn't part of my day to day. So I think a big part of my strategy is to make sure I build like a synergy between the peer research, the theoretical contributions that's tailored more to academic audience with the impact of my research and thinking about almost the end user, the individuals who actually will use the research in the career. And I think that's probably one of the reasons I chose to be a qualitative researcher,
Mm.
because it allows me to kind of think and build that interaction through the whole process, thinking even from designing the research, collecting data. Data collection for me usually involves doing interviews, so in-depth interviews. And I always try to think about how that interaction with study participants, who are the ultimate users of my research, can actually be a moment of reflection for them about whatever topic I am doing research. So I think it's and making sure that the topic I'm researching is interesting and relevant for them as well. So I think the strategy has been to make sure that synergy is always there, because I think that's what kind of helps me motivate me to do the research that I do.
Yes, and how do you connect with leaders? How do you reach out to them? How do you engage them in your research? What's that process of impact for you?
I think it depends. It varies on the research to research project. I think in many cases, with especially with the work of women leaders, I've been very lucky to work together with the Women Transforming Leadership program, and with
Mm.
the so using that platform to kind of engage certain participants for that research, and using that also as a platform to kind of showcase findings as well, and kind of get the feedback of how how if the findings are relevant and impactful for them and helpful for them in their careers. So it depends. It varies a lot.
And you mentioned the Women Transforming Leadership program, which is one of our flagship executive education programs. What challenges in talking to women leaders have you found they face in their careers?
That's an interesting question, because we try in our research to not focus necessarily on the challenges. They naturally come in the research, but I think
Mm.
we try to focus more on the positive side of female leadership. So, looking more at the solutions and strategies and what has helped them both individually and in terms of the environment that they are in, how that has helped their careers, their development, how it has helped them reach the top organization. So, we try to focus more on solutions and strategies than we think about the challenges and the obstacles.
Okay, so you'll have to forgive me for the next question then, because I'm asking you about some of the barriers you've faced as well as the opportunities. So I'm interested to know what your career aspirations are and what barriers or opportunities you envisage in actually getting there.
Okay. So I think continue, I guess, the academic route and continue developing my career as an academic. It's kind of my career aspirations. I think that more and more involves developing an external presence, doing things like this, for instance. And as many people, I've been drawn to academia as an introvert, and there's strengths being an introvert in academia because a lot of the research is you, and it can be lonely, and it's just you and your computer analyzing data, writing. And as an introvert, that goes really well with me. But I think one of my barriers would be having and wanting as well to develop an external presence that so can help with the impact of my research and being an introvert at the same time. Probably make this a little easier if I was an extrovert.
Yes, that sounds a good idea. So building an external presence. And do you envisage that you might hit sort of barriers, or there might be ways of enhancing that external presence as you progress in your career?
I think the main barrier that I see at the moment, it's myself in terms of putting the courage and kind of forcing myself to be out there. I haven't, because I haven't tried. I think I'm still in the baby steps of developing that. I haven't seen the external barriers that I'll face. So, because I think the first step is it's on my initiative and my impetus, and so I'll probably will be able to perceive those external barriers afterwards. But right now, engaging things like that is almost like a first step to do so. So I'll learn more afterwards.
Yes, and building on that, can you recall a situational time in your career when you benefited from a gender equal approach?
No, unfortunately, I don't think I can recall one.
Okay. And do you think you've either experienced or had to call out gender bias or discrimination or stereotyping whilst at work?
That's a very hard question. I think there's a short answer and a long answer. I think the short answer is that no, I haven't called out anything in relation to gender bias or discrimination and stereotype. And I cannot pinpoint to a specific event that I can say that has been caused by gender bias, discrimination, or stereotype. Thinking about the long answer, since it's Women's International Day and it is this year's focusing on bias, I think it's probably almost impossible that I have not experienced gender bias at work. So I probably have, I just haven't been aware of. And that's because bias is such a natural way, like it's part of the way almost our brain processes information and how we can like how we developed, we evolved to be able to process millions of information coming through. Unfortunately, some of this characterization generates stereotypes about gender and race and age and everything else. And I think it would be almost unlikely that I haven't experienced gender bias and discrimination and stereotype. And most likely, I also have acted in ways that might have been biased without realizing. And I think the important thing is that I think the world's trying to raise awareness for people to become more aware of the bias that they might have. Because even though it's natural and normal for banks to process that, doesn't mean it's unavoidable. And you cannot develop awareness and thinking about ways of taking people out of the stereotype boxes that are kind of culture have, kind of ingrained in us, and start looking individuals as individuals instead of looking at boxes that might not fit them.
I think that's a really good point. And I think as leaders, we all have to it's important we all engage in that sort of self-reflection and awareness raising about everything we do and the way we think about things, the way we act in situations. It's really important to have that opportunity to really reflect and think about what we do. So thank you for that. I'm just going to pause there, Joanna, give you time to take a breath, but also just before I move to the next questions, I'd just like to ask our audience, and welcome to everyone tonight, and thank you for joining us, to submit any questions you have via Mentimeter, and you'll see that there's the number here to type in your code in Mentimeter, or else you could use a QR code by taking a picture of the QR code on your phone. So you might want to go to menti.com and enter this code you see on the screen, or use the QR code there. And we welcome all your questions, and we encourage you to please to put your name and the location you're at when you submit your question. So please do go ahead and submit questions. Joanna is really welcoming any questions that you have on this topic tonight. So just having given you a little break there while you can take a breath. Coming back then to sort of thinking about what advice can you give to women who are just starting out on the academic career path? Because I think it can be quite daunting for women starting out in academia. And there's maybe a lot of perceived barriers maybe in academia that women might anticipate. So what advice can you give from your own experiences and possibly that of your research?
I think my first advice is to actually talk to people in academia and get a sense what the job really is about, because I think there are many real barriers and misconceptions too. I think there's almost this stereotypical view of the academic as the mad professor in the ivory tower. And I think that's kind of no longer valid. So I think get in touch with people and kind of learn about their experiences and learn what are their challenges that they have faced, how they have overcome those challenges. And also think about what are the benefits and the challenges. Every career is going to have both. So I think that would be one of my advices. And I think the other advice would be to think about good mentors, good collaborators, a good supervisor. I think a relationship with a supervisor can be paramount in the beginning of an academic career. And so it can make a huge difference. So I think thinking about who are your allies in a sense, who can help you navigate that career trajectory, I think it's very important.
I think that's really helpful, and I'm interested to know, because a key part of being an academic is often academic conferences. How have you been able to use academic conferences as a way to broaden your network or develop your career?
A little bit. I think probably networking something that I should definitely improve. And I think, again, is that barrier that I mentioned about the external presence of, I love research. I love, it's fantastic to be really in-depth in your research, but going out and talking to people, especially when sometimes the ideas are developing and going through that transformation that I've mentioned, sometimes can be a little challenging. I think more and more it becomes easier because you start kind of having that bigger pipeline kind of helping you through. So I think it's definitely something that that I need to improve. And of course, the pandemic has hindered that a lot, because I think some of the socializing that I would have in conferences have been completely reduced in conferences that have been online. So that has been a challenge in the past 2 years.
Yes, I think that has been something to really adapt to. I think it's being at conferences, academic conferences in person, as opposed to joining online debates and discussions, definitely has a different feel to it, and that's been quite an interesting transition, I think, to figure out how to network and how to engage with other academics in that online space.
Definitely.
So, Joanna, I know you're doing this really fascinating research on new leaders, new CEOs, and you've also been really focusing as well on women leaders. And it's really interesting, and I'd love to give you the opportunity to tell us more about your research agendas.
Thank you. So I think the thing that puts the two research agendas kind of together is that my focus is on the leader's personal and psychological journey towards and at the top organizations. So look, really what this means is I look at the individual, so that's my unit of analysis, and I research how their thoughts, their behaviors, their emotions impact their leadership and their careers. Both as they're trying to journey towards senior positions and getting to more and more senior positions, in particular the challenge that they face on the top. My stream has two streams, as you suggested. So one is about female leaders and looking at the positive aspects, looking at what has helped women to, in their careers and female leaders, to be where they are. So we usually looked at a more senior audience. And also the second one is looking at CEOs and thinking about how CEOs transition and how they integrate an organization. So thinking about this, the perception, the experiences of, and the challenge the individual face, and making sure that they have impact to the organization. And of course, those two streams get together because I'm also, my research agenda also includes looking at the impact of gender and how new CEOs integrate organizations. So what's the unique experiences of female leaders as well as the general experiences of CEOs, both male and female. So that'll be kind of a gist of the research.
Yes, and taking your research, which is focused on women in leadership, and I love the way you've taken a positive approach to this rather than looking at the barriers. What have you learned about some of the positive aspects of female leadership?
That's an interesting question. I think usually people would think about what's called the business case for female leaders. So thinking about the positive financial impact that women can have, female leaders in top organizations can have on the bottom line. However, many scholars believe that this focus on the business case can be less beneficial, can be more harmful, because the real research, like the empirical academic research on this, is mixed. Some studies show a definitely impact of women actually impacting the bottom line, and some research actually does not see a result. And the reason this mixing occur, it's because that's having a financial benefit for organizations is an outcome of actually the real benefit that female leaders can bring to organizations. And that benefit, it's about encouraging better decisions and making sure that different perspectives are taken into account. So research has shown that female leaders have different perspectives on risk taking, and in many different issues, such as innovation, as community engagement, as corporate governance. And so the real benefit of female leaders can take place if not just having women in the top or in the board, but having those voices being heard and those different perspectives being integrated. And it's important to realize that the benefits of women in the top organizations is not just about, not only about the characteristics or the behaviors of the female leaders, but also about the synergy between men and women, and that dialogue and the conversation of bringing different perspectives and integrating those different perspectives into the decision making.
Thank you very much. So it's very much a diversity argument to some extent, that bringing it, that having the diversity and inclusion of different perspectives and different ideas coming together and the synergy of them is what's actually important.
Yes, and I think another thing that we can also think about is that it helps other women below the organizations. It actually can encourage a different way that leadership is perceived within the organization, different behaviors being expected to leaders, and different views of what takes to be an effective leader that might fit women and sometimes men as well better than if it's a more male-dominated organization where being a leader, there's only one mode where leadership fits.
Yes, I think that's really interesting, is because we can sometimes have a very narrow perspective on what we understand by leadership. And so being able to broaden that out and bring that fresh perspective it sounds really interesting. And I'm interested to know, why did you choose to focus on the success stories rather than the obstacles and the ceilings that women face?
I think it probably came from my perspective, as since I came from psychology. I think it probably was influenced by psychology's movement towards positive psychology, where for most of history, psychology has looked at the negative side, at the challenges of being humans, and then there was this turn into looking at what make humans thrive. And I think coming from that perspective, I think I probably saw an opportunity that there was the same happening in the female leadership literature, where most of the literature was looking at challenges and barriers. And although that's important, I thought that was interesting to bring the other side and think about what are the empowering stories and the success and the solution and the strategies that women have used.
Yes, yes. I think it's really a very positive perspective to start looking at success, because otherwise, again, if the conversation is always about barriers and challenges, there's never any positive role models for women to look to sort of aspire towards, possibly, which again links to your point about role models and mentors as well. I'm interested to know, what surprised you about your research findings? Is there anything that you weren't expecting?
Thinking about my research on female leaders, I think two surprises come to mind. I think the first one is how responsible female leaders feel about other women, how much they're taken by the fact that their behaviors, their success, their impact as leaders will actually influence the possibilities and open the doors for other female leaders. So this level of responsibility that they feel for others was a bit surprising. Another thing is about almost the dance between environment and individual, and how on the one hand we have some female leaders who were very lucky that they had someone in their environment who saw their potential, saw their talent, and helped them along the way and helped them build the confidence to be a female leader. And so they were this luck environment. On the other hand, we had other female leaders who had no luck at all. They had terrible experiences, terrible environments, lots of challenge, but they had something within them. One of my interviewees called a fire in her tummy when I asked her about it. And it doesn't matter what challenges they faced, that helped, that nothing would stop them. So I think this dance and how there's not one answer and one way to get to be successful as a female leader, but you find this intricate dance of how both environment and individual kind of come together has been really fascinating. And I think I see that as well in my research on new CEOs, how this intricate dance between the environment and the CEO, the organization and the CEO, can have a huge different impact on their transition.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, things have moved such a long way from the research on sort of charismatic male leaders. The way you're describing it, is this really quite complex and fascinating sort of interrelationship between individuals' own motivations and what happens in the context, the environment they're in. I think is really interesting. And I'm interested to know, what strategies do women leaders adopt? And this links to one of our questions from the audience, which is asking, please share examples of the positives and opportunities you mentioned that have helped female leaders in their journeys.
I think one of the biggest, and it's funny because to talk about solution, you almost have to talk about the challenge. But I think one of the challenges that women face is that they have a double bind. They have to behave in ways that we expect women to behave and kind of have this more communal behaviors where they're nurturing, they are caring, they are empathetic. And on the other hand, they have to behave in ways that we expect leaders to behave. And this more agentic way of behaving where, aggressive, self-confident, kind of dominant in a sense. And there's this dance because women can face a lot of backslash if they act in a agentic way. But if they don't, they're not perceived as effective leaders. So the success strategies that our research and research others have shown is almost this merge where they kind of show both things at the same time, so that they interact almost like they have strength and care at the same time. So they're not just being one thing or the other, and they are kind of interacting. So to give an example, there's some fascinating research on delegation, because delegation is such an important behavior for leaders. And delegation actually have those two sides of being both a behavior that have agentic and communal aspects. But female leaders often are so afraid of being agentic because they have received backslash for doing so, that they focus on the agentic aspect of delegating. And so they refrain from delegating. And when they do so, funny enough, because they're so concentrated in the agentic, they're less caring and less considerate of the people who they're delegating to, which means they're almost going against their probably the natural tendency of their, the expectations of women. And one of the strategies to reframe their mindset in terms of thinking about delegation through a more communal perspective. Another strategy coming from our
Joanna, can I just ask you about that? When you say a communal perspective, what does communal mean to you?
I think it's realizing that when you're delegating, you can be caring. You can look at delegation as, if you're a leader and you're delegating to one of your subordinates, you are potentially giving them opportunity of growth. You can think about delegating something that it's normal and easy for you to do, but can be a growth opportunity for someone to actually engage in that activity that they haven't done before. So I think that would be what I mean, is like thinking about the other, considering the other would be what I meant in this sense by communal.
Yes, that's really helpful. Thank you. And what lessons from your research would you recommend to other leaders, particularly maybe drawing on your new CEO research and thinking about that sort of moving to a new role, what it means to make that transition, particularly maybe for people who are making that transition to CEO or senior leader for the first time? What have you noticed in your research?
An interesting thing about my research on thinking on new CEOs is that there's almost a push for the individual to kind of come in and kind of take control and be forceful, because everybody, what my research shows is that kind of everybody's kind of wanting to please the new CEO. It's really hard to get information. You know less about the organization, and so there's almost this kind of force to help to make you think that you can come forcefully. And some of my CEOs, funny enough, they talk almost like they believe every other CEO but them had a blank slate. But their case was specific and different because they didn't have a blank slate, because they had to consider specific aspects of the organization, of the past leaders. And that blank slate doesn't exist to any CEO. So I think it's important to consider that dance that I've mentioned about the individual and the organization. And one interesting thing about that dance that my research shows is that the organization's kind of, okay, show me what you have and give me your mark. But so the individual might kind of forget to consider the aspects of the organization of integrating that. So that's that delicate dance. There's a delicate dance that exists in those cases.
Yes, it's really interesting, isn't it, that CEOs feel this pressure, they feel under this sort of pressure to make a mark, to put their own stamp on an organization. And yet sometimes that can be really counterproductive in a way, to try and force that agenda too early on and maybe not take account of that history, that backstory of the organization, and recognize where it's at and the context that it's in. So I think that's a really, really fascinating perspective. And just to conclude my questions, because I'm aware we've got some fascinating questions here from our audience, and I'm really keen to have an opportunity to explore those with you. So just a few rapid fire questions as an ending from me. So 3 things here. What's the best advice you were given?
I think the best advice has been just to find something that you're passionate about to do it.
Yes, I think that's true. That's what can keep you through the difficult times, maybe, and keep that internal motivation if you have that passion. And advice you'd give others?
Funny enough, just to think about passion, because passion can burn out easily, right? So actually, I think that is almost finding love, because if you find something that you really love, you can stick to it, to the kind of the difficult, the challenging times, as you say, motivating. So I think it has to be, it's not only passion, but something that you can kind of sustain the passion. So almost, thinking about something that helps you sustain the passion and keep on doing that, so it's almost like thinking about love in a sense.
Yes. And what do you wish you'd known?
I wish I had known that all the different twists and turns and changes that my career had would actually had a thread, had actually a direction, but I wasn't aware of that direction. And only in hindsight, like looking now, I can see how everything has built up to where I am. And I wish I had realized that thread beforehand.
Yeah, that's an interesting perspective. I know one senior academic said to me that even though when you look back on the work you've done, it might appear not to have any particular direction or sort of linkages, the secret is to build a narrative from those apparently, contradictory or stories or work that you've done, and start to build that into a coherent narrative. So I thought that was really helpful advice, as you go on your academic journey.
Mm-hmm.
So I've got some very interesting questions here from the audience. So the first one is there a particular book which has influenced you at work? And if so, what is it?
Which book has influence? I think they'll be very academic. It's not
Yes.
for like the British audience. Um, um, I love, let me think which ones. I think there's several books. I think it depends on the research you're doing. Um, I think there's one from Joana, which is a professor in Harvard, that looked at the process, how the process of selecting a new CEO. It's something about in search of the heroic CEO. No, it's not like that. I don't remember the title now. I'm terrible with names. But it's about Joana, and it looked at the process of selecting an individual for the CEO role. And I thought that was, at a time that I read, like really eye-opening to the research I was doing. So that's one that I can think of.
And thank you. And someone's asked here, do you yourself mark International Women's Day, and if so, how?
I don't, unless it counts putting 2 girls in bed after this. So no, I think reading from my 2 daughters, it's for bedtime, is what I'm gonna do for Women's International Day.
Well, you're helping today. You're helping us today anyway by being in conversation around International Women's Day. So that's a really good starting point, I think.
Definitely.
And we've got another question here, which is interesting, which is, in a globalized world, does your research show that different cultures or religions influence the company to choose a woman to be a CEO?
That's a really, really interesting question. I haven't looked at that. I think I have looked more at the perspective of the CEO within the UK, because I wanted to have similar corporate governance. I'm sure it has an effect. It's probably a very interesting future research to conduct, and I'd love to have the answer to that, but unfortunately, I don't have it right now. A fascinating question.
Thank you. And just to say to our audience, please do post your questions on Mentimeter. We have a QR code, and we have, if you go into www.menti.com and use the numeric code there, you can access being able to put in a question. If you could put your name and location, that'd be great, because we'd love to know where you're based. And also you can use this QR code by just taking a photo with your phone, and that should take you into the Mentimeter site, and you can post your question there. We really welcome any questions from you to Joanna. And thank you very much to everyone in our audience who's posted their questions so far. We really appreciate that. And it's really fascinating to hear your thoughts and ideas behind International Women's Day and Joanna's research. So Joanna, just going back to another question here, which I think is a really interesting one. One member of the audience has asked, can women be boxed in by women-led organisations that can be inherently nurturing, as this is in itself a bias, as everyone has various personalities?
That's an interesting question. I have never looked at women. I usually focus on women who are in male-dominated environments, but I'm sure that there are different dynamics within female-led environments that will have its challenges and its opportunities. There's some research looking that sometimes women can be really tough with other women. So there's something called like a queen bee phenomenon, where women kind of become more protective of their territory. And I think that happens with many minorities. But I haven't looked at women-led and women-only organizations. I'm sure there's a specific way in which those organizations would perceive an effective leader to be, like every organization has. And so I think being boxed in, depending on their career objectives, and I think it would depend on how well they fit with what's considered effective leadership in those organizations.
Yes, I think that's right. I think it's interesting whether women-led organizations create a different culture or a different emphasis.
Yes, definitely. And it might be interesting to think, if we think about gender equality, I think the balance of and the different perspectives that both genders can bring can be helpful. So in the same way, I would argue that only completely male-dominated organization might be not beneficial for the organization. I imagine a female-led organization might actually probably benefit from some different perspectives than a male perspective as well.
Yes, I think that's true, and I think we've not got any further audience questions at the moment. So I'd just like to thank you hugely, Joanna, for taking the time today to be in conversation about the themes from International Women's Day and how that's and some of the themes from your research on new CEOs and women leaders. It's been absolutely fascinating to hear your perspectives and to hear your reflections on other research on leaders. And we really appreciate your time today. So thank you very much.
And thank you, Eleanor. Thank you so much for your fantastic questions. And it's been a pleasure having this conversation with you. And thank you to the audience for the questions you posed. Some really, really interesting questions. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
Thank you.